Okay, we're getting ready to start here. First of all, somebody's celebrating their 47th wedding anniversary today. Oh, should I wait? All right, let's do that. Somebody's 47th wedding anniversary. They can stand up maybe for a second. It's Gerald and Jenny Boucher. So glad you chose to spend your 47th here with us.
We wouldn't want to be anywhere else.
Looks like we got an unbelievable crowd again. At least 100, probably a few more. When they asked me how many, I thought it'd be 80. So this is good. We're over that. Here's a list of coming programs we got coming up, and we're actually booked about a year ahead, which is crazy. I never thought we'd get to that point. We have had a few switch around though. Next month was supposed to be Cats TV during their own program, but they've had some problems with infrastructure work down at the facility, so we're going to postpone theirs till next year. So on September 25th, we'll have Owen Johnson, Professor Emeritus of Journalism at IU, and he'll give a presentation on the life of Ernie Pyle, which should be really good. October 30th, 2018, Carrie Beam, Director of the Wiley House, will give a detailed program on the Wiley House and what an important place it occupies in our local history. November 27th, the Monroe County History Center, Director Susan Dyer will give a program focusing on the role of women played at RCA in World War II war production. December 18th. Now we moved that up a week because the last Tuesday would be December 25th. I don't think that's going to work, so we moved it up to December 18th, and local author and historian Derek Ritchie will return to show more old photos that we scanned down at the Herald Times. We did this about 3 years ago, and it's a raft of photos that people here help identify. So those are always a fun time. January, now we're into 2019, January 29th, IU Professor Emeritus James Madison will give a program on the bicentennial in this county. February 26th, John Summerlot of IU will give a presentation about Captain Williamson and Alexander and the Alexander Memorial, which sits on the south side of the courthouse lawn. March 26th, George, right here. 5 years ago, almost to the day, he did a program on the Monon, the history of the Monon, and he's going to do that again in March. So new and improved. New and improved, he said. I think when he did it, we had 15, 17 people here 5 years ago. So. And in April 30th, Michael White of Cats TV will give a history of Cats TV. It's been serving us for about 45 years, I think. So that should be good. May 28th, local historian and author James Capshew will give a program on the life of Herman B. Wells. So, June 25th, Brad Cook will return for his 5th program, I think, to show more local vintage programs from the IU Archives collection. And then finally on July 30th, Christine Friesel of the Monroe County Public Library will return for her 4th presentation. And we haven't decided what it is yet, but she'll figure it out later, I'm sure. And now my Minister of Propaganda, George Carpenter, has a few words.
It's always nice when Mike gets applause. First, I'd like to take the opportunity to introduce my wife, Mary Ann Carpenter, who's come today, and my granddaughter, Maria, who's come from Oklahoma here today. Stand up, Maria, so everybody can see. Mike asked the other day, he said, well, somebody asked why I got up here when I've been sitting in my chair for so long. Well, I never got to see all of you before. And I'm always amazed at the size of our crowd, that we started with 6 people about 6 years ago, and now we've gone to over 100 today. I'd like to thank the Legion very much for their hospitality. Please be generous with our servers. They work for tips, so that's why they're here. Loretta, and who's your help today, Loretta?
Shondell.
Shondell, okay. Also like to thank Cats TV. You guys are #1 with us. I'm looking forward to your presentation next year. Because of Cats TV, we're able to post our videos on YouTube. And I must apologize about that because I had a problem yesterday getting the YouTube video announcements out. So we're going to work on that. Some of you should maybe got a letter from me with no content. Well, nothing new there. At any rate, I'm not going to stay up here and talk a whole lot longer. I hope that you all will give us your email address. If we don't have it on your distribution list already. Anything for the good of the cause? Anything I need to know about? Yeah. Thanks so much for your time.
Thanks, George. I should also mention, but my mother, Mary Carter's here today. She's a loyal follower. And I have about 4 cousins over there, so it's a family affair. They follow us around. And then there are probably 16 people from our dear old BHS graduating class of 1964. So nice to get their support. So today we have David Nord. David is a retired professor of journalism and adjunct professor of history at IU Bloomington, where he also served as an associate editor and interim editor of the Journal of American History. His program is named Rivers, Roads, and Rails, Mapping the Transportation History of Spring Mill State Park. I have seen this, and so has Clay Stuckey. We made a trip down there probably 8 months ago to see his program, and I decided that people would love it up here. So I could say more about it, but you guys got the mail-outs, and I don't want to do his program for him. So, Dave.
Well, thank you, and Michael, and it's great to see you. Of course, I can't see you now, but that's okay, because the important thing is you have to see this. So, and those of you that are over there, I'm in your way, aren't I? Okay. I'm going to have to move this back a bit. Is that good enough? Okay. All right. I'm a different kind of Monroe County historian from the kind you usually have here. I'm a historian from Monroe County. I've lived here for 40 years, and I love Monroe County, but I'm not a historian of Monroe County. Curiously enough, I'm a historian now of Lawrence County. Through most of my career here at IU, I was a historian of journalism, and I focused on big cities, popular journalism, and other forms of publishing. And I spent my time in New York and Philadelphia, Chicago, and worked with those places. And now I'm working with places like Fort Ritner, Tunnelton, and Springville. And it's a different world out there. And you may wonder, how does somebody who has spent 40 years in this county get into Lawrence County? And the answer is Spring Mill. Spring Mill brought me into that. Several years ago, my son was the woodworker at Spring Mill, and I'm assuming that most of you, or all of you, know what Spring Mill is and know what it's like. And if you don't, by the way, then this will be like a publicity talk to get you down there to have a look. But he was the woodworker at Spring Mill, where they do antique crafts. And I'd been to Spring Mill many times over the years, but I hadn't thought much about the place. I would go down there when he was there and hang out at the wood shop a little bit with him. And in this picture, that's the wood shop right there. This picture, by the way, is a postcard from the 1930s. It's the early 1930s that this card was made. So I'd hang out at the wood shop, and next to the wood shop was the tavern, or inn, the Stagecoach Inn. And while I was there, I'd sometimes read some of the signs, and I had some skepticism about what I was seeing there. It talked about a stagecoach road. I didn't see any stagecoach road there. some of the literature talks about shipping products on the White River, and I really didn't have any idea of where the White River was in relation to Spring Mill State Park. I'd crossed it many times at Bedford, but I didn't have a sense of it. The literature also said that when the railroad came, it passed the village by. And that I thought was particularly odd because it actually passed by the village. I knew from having been there when the leaves are off the tree that there's a railroad that runs right by the village, just up the hill from the canyon that the village sits in. So I decided, since my wife also was doing some work there as a volunteer in the needle arts, that I should do some volunteering for Spring Mill State Park, and what I do is history, so I decided to do history, and that drew me into, more generally into Lawrence County history, working through Spring Mill. So this is the Spring Mill story that I first got into, a transportation history of Spring Mill. What was this place like when it was an actual working economic place in the early 19th century? And how did it become what it is today, which is essentially an isolated, pretend village in some ways, sitting in a box canyon, unconnected to the rest of the world around it. So that's the story that I want to explore with pictures and maps today. But first up, let me, I'll start with just some things for you to look at. I won't tell you what you're seeing until we get into this a little bit more later, but I'm going to show you a couple of pictures here, 3 pictures actually. Here's one. This is picture 1. I'll come back to this, but just think about what you're seeing here. Here's another picture, a wood scene near the park. What is this? Well, I'll come back to that. And then here's another picture. I'm standing up on a bluff looking down into something. What am I seeing here? And this is the 3rd picture that I want you to think about a bit as we go into this. But first up, let me take you back. I'll do this in 3 parts, 3 main parts. First talk about southern Indiana in general, and then talk about Lawrence County, and then talk a bit about the village itself with maps. Start out here with Indiana and how Indiana looked in 1814. This actually is how Indiana looks right now. This is one of my favorite scenes of Indiana that you don't usually see unless you live in southern Indiana. And many of you may know exactly what this scene is. It's Horseshoe Bend on the Ohio River near Leavenworth. And when in 1814, it probably looked a bit like this, dense woods. And the way people got into Indiana, mostly in 1814, was by coming down this river and then going up by rough roads or by other rivers, the Wabash and the White in particular, into the heart of the southern portion of Indiana, which was being settled during this era. In 1814, and I picked that year because that's the year that the first mill was built, it's Spring Mill, not the building that's there now, which was built in 1817, but the first mill at Spring Mill was 1814. And there was a lot of movement into Indiana during this period. The war of 1812 was winding down in this part of the country. That was an Indian dispossession war as much as a war against the British Empire. And I apologize to you today that I could tell you a very different story about the settlement of Indiana, which is about the people that lived here before American settlement and were dispossessed of Indiana so that the settlers from the Ohio River could move in. And that's the story I'm telling and not the Indian side of the story. If you're interested in the Indian side of the story, which I think you should be, I'll give you a good place to look. Take a look at Colin Calloway's book, The Shawnees and the, let's see, and the War, the Shawnees and the War for America, which was published about 10 years ago. It's an Indiana history of the other side of the story, but I'm telling you the usual settlement side of the story today. So when people came here, they needed to know where to go, and they got maps and they got guidebooks. This is an example of a guidebook from that era. And it was published by written, put together by John Mellish, who became an important map maker. The map that appears in that book is a terrible map, but it shows you a rough look of, this is the Indiana portion of a U.S. map in that guidebook, a cheap map. And we can focus in on a little tighter here so you can see that it shows the rivers, it shows the Wabash, it shows the two forks of the White River coming in the Ohio. The only road it shows here in Indiana is the old Buffalo Trace, the early sort of natural road in some ways that connected the falls of the Ohio with Vincennes. And it's poorly shown on this map, but that's an early rough map of Indiana. But maps began to get very good after 1814 because this land was surveyed beginning in 1805, and in this part of Indiana, most of those professional surveys were being done in 1811, 1812. I think most of Lawrence County was surveyed in 1811. Monroe, I think 1812, not quite sure. And this map, which shows Indiana as well as Illinois territory, we can focus in tighter on the area of southern Indiana, showing Orange County, and the area that became Lawrence County is here, and then Monroe County above that. A map that's based on surveys has better river placement, as well as begin to work with roads as well. And this map shows the old Buffalo Trace Road, the way it actually went from the falls of the Ohio across the Blue River and between the Patoka and the East Fork of the White River to cross the White River near Petersburg, where Petersburg is today. This is the 1819 edition of what's often considered the first true state map of Indiana by John Mellish. And I picked out the 1819 edition instead of the 1817 edition because it shows Lawrence County and Monroe County by name. As you know, both of them were founded in 1818. So looking at John Mellish's map at the southern part of Indiana, it's beginning to show the main east-west roads from Louisville to Vincennes and from Cincinnati through Salem, both of which I can actually bring us in a little bit tighter here, with Lawrence County above Orange County, and the road from Salem coming through either Paoli or Orleans, the road from the Ohio River, New Albany coming across through Paoli, and both of them crossing not below the Ohio, not following the Buffalo Trace, but following a road that crossed at Hinduston with a ferry. If you have ferries, you change the roads because fords and ferries are in totally different places, and so that's the beginning of the first formal stagecoach route in Indiana. But no roads in Lawrence County, none in Monroe either are shown on this map. Here's Lawrence County up close. I'll give you a look at it up close here so you can really not only see the rivers and creeks, but you can see the coloring of the map. When you look at one of these maps up close, it looks like pretty smudge work, but these maps are hand-colored and done fairly quickly. They look pretty good, but this is quite a blow-up of the Lawrence County map. And it does show the main ferry across the river near the county seat of Lawrence County, which was Palestine in 1818. Doesn't show Bedford because that wasn't founded until 1825. The only town it shows is Bono, which had aspirations to be a town of some significance, and by the end of the 19th century was already a cow pasture, as it is today. You folks, since you're from Monroe County, I'll give you some Monroe here as well, even though it's sort of out of the realm of the Spring Mill story. But here's Monroe above Lawrence County in the Mellish map of 1818. Again, there's no roads shown on these maps, just creeks and rivers. And I think seeing these two places side by side gives you an idea of how different they are. Lawrence County is a county that was driven by, or that was highly influenced by the fact that it's a river place. Monroe County is highly influenced by the fact that there are no rivers at all, just creeks. It's the watershed between two rivers rather than a river place itself. Here's Monroe. Here's Monroe in 1819, up close. And you can see it shows Salt Creek, Clear Creek, Bean Blossom, Indian Creek, and then here's the west fork of the White River where Bean Blossom Creek enters the river at Gosport. So for Spring Hill, the mill, the operation there, the business there, the fact that it was near the river was an important element because they did use that river for shipping goods downstream. Now, things began to change road-wise in 1820 actually, when it was decided that the capital of Indiana should be in Indianapolis. That was a problem because there wasn't anything there where Indianapolis was founded. There was no city and no county even at first, no settlement much. The idea was to make it a central location. And to be a central location, you need roads. The General Assembly authorized a collection of roads in 1821. And as you can see, even though you can't see the names here, you can see they radiate out of Indianapolis. The whole idea of this legislation was to subsidize roads that would make Indianapolis accessible from the settled parts of Indiana. Here's a closer look at the area south of Bloomington, so you can see what these roads look like that were authorized. Now, they're in basically straight lines because they're not surveyed, they're just authorized to go these general directions. How important are these roads? Well, they're pretty important. The road that I'm most interested in is important not only for Lawrence County, but for Monroe County. It's a road that on the Ohio River is here at Horseshoe Bend, where I showed you, from the town of Fredonia, which is down there by Leavenworth, and it goes almost straight north through Paoli, authorized, crossing the White River in Lawrence County at Palestine, and then on up to Bloomington, and then on to Martinsville in Indianapolis. Now, if that sounds like a direction for a road that you might be familiar with, that's not by happenstance that it is. Eventually, this road would evolve into something like Highway 37. The other roads that I'm interested in Lawrence County, one of them is the road from the falls of the Ohio, Jeffersonville, or New Albany to Bono, and that became somewhat of an important road because of going through Salem, an important town. But that road, straight through north, is an interesting one to me. The third road here in our counties is Rockport Road, the road that was authorized to connect Bloomington with the town of Rockport on the Ohio River. And that road was somewhat built as Rockport Road in the 19th century in Lawrence County and Monroe County, less so farther south. And now only Monroe County uses that name for one of its roads, but you're familiar with how it goes through. Monroe County is pretty much the way it still does today. So this road is the one that I'm particularly interested in. Here's a map of Indiana from 1831, And this one is the first state map to show that road from Fredonia up into Lawrence County through Orange County. Here's Fredonia on the Ohio River. The road comes up through Paoli, Orleans, Palestine. Bedford now is there as the county seat after 1825, and then on farther north. This map, though, I think is the one that really helps us understand what was going on the roads in our area in the 1830s. This is a map from 1839 of Ohio and Indiana. And what makes it a very interesting map is that it was prepared by a map maker who was also the topographer of the post office. It's a postal map. It shows post offices, post roads, as well as canals and railroads, etc. There aren't any railroads in Indiana at this time, and canals were just beginning. But the one things I'm interested in is post roads. And the neat thing about this map is that it not only traces where these roads went, but what kind of roads they were. This is part of the legend of the map, telling you what kind of road is going to be marked on the map. And this, by the way, is just where the map was torn and fixed, so that line means nothing. But it shows a 4-horse mail post coach road. That is a road that's good enough to take a mail coach with 4 horses, is signified by a dark line and a less dark line. A 2-horse mail stage road is 2 lines. A 1-horse mail road, or a sulky, is a line and a dotted line. So being able to see those 3 different kinds of quality of roads gives you a sense of what things were like on the ground. For those of you, if you're not familiar with this, DO, that's 19th century abbreviation for ditto. So this just means 2-horse mail stage road. Ditto, ditto. Yeah.
What year was this?
1839.
1839.
1839. So let's look at our area on this map. This is, again, the same kind of area I've been showing you from Fredonia. And look, here's Louisville. And it shows the road from Fredonia is a 4-horse mail coach road coming through Paoli on up through Lawrence County. Looking closer, here we are looking at Lawrence County. Here's Jackson and Washington counties. And coming up from Orleans, it goes through Spring Mill. Spring Mill, by 1839, was the crossroads of southern Lawrence County. And this road came through Spring Mill, crossed the river at Palestine, which doesn't exist anymore. It was abandoned in favor of Bedford. But that's where it crossed, right at the north, the meridian, the second meridian that's used for surveying. Crossed the river onto Bedford, and then on to Bloomington, and on to Martinsville, and on to Indianapolis. So that's the major road in both of our counties, with other roads radiating in different ways. Bedford over to Brownstown, or this road coming from Spring Mill to Bono and down to Salem. So I put Monroe County in here as well. Here we are in Monroe County, and we'll look at Monroe just briefly so you can see what the post roads looked like in 1839. Obviously, in Monroe County, Bloomington is the thing as it is today. Here's that Fredonia Indianapolis road coming through Bloomington and on up into Martinsville and Martin County. These other roads, here's Rockport Road. These other roads become familiar. Here's Bloomfield Road. The road to Ellettsville is Terre Haute, heading to Terre Haute. road to Columbus. And this road didn't amount to much in the 19th century, but parts of it are followed. Even today, rebuilt as 446 through the lake. So another way of looking at roads is not maps, but guidebooks. And here is one, also from 1839, the Western Tourist and Immigrant's Guide. And it has information on travel as well as a fold-out map. And here's a list of post offices in the state of Indiana at that time. And if I focus in a little more closely, here's the post office I'm interested in, Hamer's Mills, which was another name for Spring Mill. And this shows that it's in Lawrence County. It's 85 miles from Indianapolis. This guidebook lists the most important stage routes. And given what I told you about the 1821 Act, you won't be surprised to see that most of the most important stage routes in Indiana were about getting people to and from Indianapolis. So every one of these on this page is Indianapolis to Cincinnati, Indianapolis via Lawrenceburg, Indianapolis to Madison, and so forth, Indianapolis to Terre Haute, and Indianapolis to Fredonia. That's the one that I'm interested in. Here's that one up close. So this is a stage route then in 1839 from Indianapolis to Fredonia, and all of these towns are towns that you're familiar with, except maybe far west. But we see we're going. This is mileage from Indianapolis, 16, 29, 48, from Martinsville to Bloomington through Springville to Bedford to Orleans, and between Bedford and Orleans was Spring Mill or Hamer Mills on that road that you saw on the map. Far west it was a crossroads in Johnson County. Have any of you ever heard of Far West before? Well, it doesn't exist anymore, but it was a crossroads town in the southwest corner of Johnson County between Indianapolis and Martinsville.
Would that be about where Morgantown is now?
Well, I'm not quite sure. Yeah.
What's the left column symbol stand for? The 13.
That's mileage between these stops. 13, it's 19 miles from Martinsville to Bloomington. This is cumulative. So both are mileages, but one's cumulative and one's between. So railroads change things. And in Indiana, and in Ohio, and in Illinois, and in some other states as well, but especially those three, the revolution brought by railroads was in the 1850s. And it's almost unbelievable to imagine how fast railroads were built in this part of the country in the 1850s. The first railroad in Indiana, and the reason I gave you this one that you can't see very well is just so you can, this is an 1858 map, and you can see just the spider webs of railroads already in 1858 in Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio, radiating and being connected to the west, St. Louis, and also Chicago. So yeah.
So that's part of the reason we're called Crossroads in America.
Well, usually that's associated with the highways, but yeah, I guess so. And I'll give you an idea of how fast things were done in Indiana. The first railroad in Indiana was the Madison and Indianapolis Railroad, which was completed in the late 1840s. In 1850, Indiana had less than 100 miles of railroad, 1850. By 1854, 4 or 5 years later, it had 1,400 miles of railroads. And that's pretty remarkable. And by comparison, in 4 years, I-69, nothing much happened at all. But of course, railroad companies have their way. in 1850s that they could possibly have today. Here's that same map showing Indiana up close, 1858. And probably the main railroad, Indianapolis is, by the late 1850s, is the crossroads of rail transportation in Indiana. And to some extent, of course, it's hoping to compete with Chicago, but that's not going to happen. It is a crossroads of transportation to St. Louis. The Cleveland-Indianapolis Railroad, which is sometimes called the Bellefontaine because it went through the town of Bellefontaine, and the Terre Haute-Alton Railroad, that connection of Cleveland to St. Louis was a major rail connection that was pretty much completed by the late 1850s. The rail connections that I'm interested in are these two in southern Indiana. If you see, Mitchell is the crossroads of two railroads in Lawrence County. And those railroads are the Ohio and Mississippi Railroad from Cincinnati to St. Louis, and the New Albany and Salem Railroad from the Ohio River to Michigan City, which later became the Monroe. Here's another railroad map from 1858. It's the same year as the other one, and it shows Indiana more closely. And if we look here at the counties, this is Lawrence County, and each one of these little squares on this map is one section. It's a square mile. And you can see with these black lines how Lawrence County was and was becoming a rail crossroads. The New Albany and Salem Railroad comes up this way, takes a turn to the west, and then straight up to Bloomington, Crawfordsville, Greencastle, and on to Lake Michigan. The Ohio and Mississippi Railroad from Cincinnati comes through between Cincinnati and St. Louis. But Spring Mill is still on this map. You have folks in the back can't see that, but the words here are Spring Mill. And in 1858, it's still a crossroads of roads, but the railroad center has become Mitchell by 1858.
The east-west train, is the track still there?
It is. The east-west train still runs. It's a CSX train. In the late 19th century, it became the B&O Railroad, and it still runs a couple of trains a day. Yeah. That crossroads at Mitchell, where nothing existed before the trains crossed, it's still there. This is it. If you go to Mitchell, you can see this crossroads in downtown Mitchell. With looking into the distance is the CSX line that's still in use, and the Monon coming across. Well, I don't think I need a backup right now. That's Mitchell today. Mitchell was made by railroads and sort of undone, I guess, by railroads. Mitchell hasn't grown very much in the last number of decades as railroad transportation declined. So let me take you more deeply inside the county itself, inside Lawrence County. This is a favorite scene of mine from Lawrence County, not just because it has my wife Martha in it, but it has a nice view of the White River. This is about as close to the White River from Spring Mill as you can get, and it's at a church park on the White River, about 2 miles from the park, from Spring Mill Park, and it shows what Lawrence County is like around there with its river and its bluffs overlooking the river. About 100 feet we're above the river at that point, and that's about how low the river lies as it cuts through Lawrence County. 100 feet to 200 feet below the plain, the topography around it. And I'll come back to talking about that a little bit more. just for those of you that don't know the county well, here's an 1879 map of the county that shows it not too much different from what it is today, with Bedford being the centerpiece and the river flowing across in meanders across the county from east and west. We look a little more closely here at the part of Lawrence County that Spring Mill is near. Here's Mitchell and Bedford in this, and you can see how the railroad followed the river and then came out of the valley and down south toward Mitchell. We look a little more closely here. Here's the river. Here's the railroad coming south over to Mitchell. You can look even more closely at that area with the roads being more visible here. And for those of you that are close, you're beginning to actually see Spring Mill identified. Here's, and I can even go closer. Here's Hamer's Mill Cave. Hamer is the owner of that property. GM Mill here is the grist mill. There's the grist mill and other buildings. Here's George Donaldson's property, the Scotsman who bought property in the Spring Mill area that later came to IU. Here's the old roads. Here's the road from Orleans coming up, coming through the village, going up the side of the bluff and on to Palestine, Bedford, and Bloomington. You wonder where the park is today? There it is. I've drawn in the outline of Spring Mill Park on that same map. So this is the 1879 map with the outline of Spring Mill Park drawn on it. With here's Hamer Cave. Shawnee Cave is what we now call Donaldson Cave. Here's Twin Caves, Bronson Cave, and the current entrance comes through here. So that's 1879. Spring Mill was a crossroads of various roads coming in, and that's the park as it appears drawn across that old map. Here's the map of the area later. In 1879, that area, the mill village, was doing pretty well still. It was abandoned by 1915 when this map was made. And that tells you, you can see that on this map. It shows some of the roads. I can come in closer on this. Well, I actually should stick with this for a minute. This county road is the old Fredonia-Annapolis road coming up. But the road actually through the village doesn't even appear on this map anymore. This is 1915. This road does. It goes around where the cemetery is, Donaldson Cave, appears on the map, but not the road through the village anymore. Since you're Monroe County people, I thought I'd give you a Monroe County guy. This is Carl Eigenman standing outside Donaldson Cave in the 1890s after he's been looking at blind fish in the cave for most of the day and night. So there you get a little Monroe County local history as well. So how does this look today? This is a current map of that area today. This is the official Lawrence County highway map. What they've done here really is these roads still exist, but they've been stubbed off at the park. I'll move in a little more closely here. This road coming from, that was part of the old road to Bedford is stubbed off. This road here that comes from Mitchell that was, I'll show you later, was the entrance to the park for a while. It's stubbed off. This road by the campground store that goes on to Stonington is blocked off there. The only way you can get into the park now is to come in through this road from below, and the park roads are isolated. But they still use some of the roads that existed before. This road around the rim of the canyon is an old road, and the road that follows through there is still part of that east-west road that was there. Yeah.
Little minutia, what's the number 4 that's in the rectangular area or square area, 33?
Oh, those are section numbers. One of the great things about dealing with maps is that when townships were laid out with 36 square mile sections, the sections were all numbered in 1811, and they're the same. So when I've been working with Lawrence County maps, it's real handy to be able to look at a map that's drawn by a surveyor in 1811 and have it be the same thing as today. So that's still what surveyors use, those same numbers. It's a good way to be able to compare maps and to lay them over each other. So a little bit more about the village itself and how it was transformed from the 19th century. This is a view of the flume from Hamer Cave going down to the mill. It shows my son's workshop here on the left. This is the sawmill, and the mill building is kind of obscured. It looks north toward the big bluff that I'll talk about in a minute. Here's what a current map of the park looks like. You come in at the south side, and it's mostly a circle, with this road having been built in the 1930s. The other roads are kind of what they once were in the pre-park days. We'll focus on a little bit more closely here. So here's the current park. You no longer can get into the park with a car. You come in, you park here, and you walk into the Pioneer Village area. So this is the road that comes into the park now, but you no longer are driving through the village like you were in the 1930s. Here's a park map from 1932, and this shows how you negotiated the park roads when it was first opened. It was founded by the state of Indiana in 1927 and opened in 1930, and this is the first tourist map made of the park in 1932. You can focus in on a little tighter on this. This is how you got into the park. You came in on the west side on one of the old roads. You drove through here and then down the hill through the village and parked where the concession area is right now. So you came in the way a stagecoach on the Fredonia to Indianapolis line would have gone in the 19th century. Here's that a little more closely. You drove your car in through here, drove over here, and drove down the hill. Here's the mill building from the 1870s when it was still in business. But by the early 20th century, it was pretty much abandoned. This is a view of the mill building in the early 20th century. What I like about this picture is it shows how the road is abandoned. The building is too. The windows have been knocked out. The local bad boys have done that, I guess. And this is the road. This is the road through the village. This is the wall that's still there and restored. But the road is basically gone. I mean, it's not being used anymore. In 1910 or so, I forget when this particular picture was taken. But as soon as the park was renovated to be a park, they spruced up that road and turned it back into a road for actual access to the village. This is what that road looked like in the early 1930s. The still house here is the wood shop where my son worked, and this is the tavern, and this is the road that comes through past the mill, and it's a rough gravel road in the early 1930s. That's when this postcard was made. And here's another view of it. It's spruced up quite a bit. A nice stone gutter is built along it on both sides. But it's essentially a road just like it was in the 19th century, where only now you drive your car on it. You come down the hill, you drive through there, and you go over and park in the parking lot. By the 1970s, that road had been closed, well, actually it was closed by the 40s to traffic. And by the 1970s, when this picture was taken, that road had sort of atrophied. It was still gravel, still had a nice gutter, but it had grass growing between the path and the gutter. And this is what it looks like today. You wouldn't exactly think of this as being a real road. It has the stone gutter, but the path is just a walking path. That's today. So let's walk down that path. Here we go down. We're going north now, walking north toward the bluff. And the road seems to kind of make a little turn here as a service road. Bulldozer there, that's my car. But we're not interested in this service road here. We're interested in what lies beyond that bulldozer. This is a pile of rubble. But you get past that and you find a road going up the bluff on the north side. And that bluff and that road is the 19th century road that was used well into the 1930s.
Is this part of the macadam roads? Part of the macadam roads where they cut logs and laid them down for a road?
Well, that's not a macadam road, but no, it's not. In fact, this road was paved in the 30s because cars drove on it. But it was, I'll show you a bit of that. I walked this road one day, this road bed, one day after a rain, and that's pavement that's revealed up the side of the hill. So there's actually some pavement left from the 1930s, but of course that wasn't, it's asphalt, that wasn't there in the 19th century. In the 19th century, it was probably not macadam, meaning a broken stone road, but just gravel or dirt. So you walk up the hill where the road used to be, and I'm standing now on a park road looking north toward the railroad. And if any of you have been there and you wondered where the railroad is, at the top of the hill on the park road, just stop your car and look for it, and you can see it. There's the railroad, about 50 yards from the northern rim of the canyon. So I walked across this road, walked across the railroad, and on the north side of that railroad, this is the continuation of that road. And this is the picture that I first showed you at the beginning of this talk. So what you're seeing here is a remnant of the Fredonia to Indianapolis stagecoach road, just north of Spring Mill. Nothing more now than just an indentation in the landscape. But you keep walking and come out of the woods, and somebody's cut the grass here, and there's a house. And you come to a road, and here it is. Here is that road. And it's a county road now, and it's called Hardman Road. And here on, this is the current map. It's this road. So I walked up the hill, across the railroad tracks, Hardman Road stepped off.
Does that go all the way up to Palestine?
Well, sort of. Lehigh Cement Company has closed off parts of it. Here's a broader view of the county roads. Essentially, that old road followed what became Quackenbush Road, and maybe different ways. Roads are changing all the time. Right now, this is Lehigh Cement Company property, quarries, and a lake, and you can't drive on Quackenbush Road anymore. By that I mean it's barricaded. If there were just a sign that said you can't drive on it, I would have done it or walked on it. But it's pretty closed off. But that's the north direction of that old road. So again, coming back to this map that shows 1879, what we've done here is gone up the hillside, across the railroad track, and then on north. Now let's look the other direction. This is looking south. This is the main street of the village after it was abandoned and before it was restored. Just a track, essentially a track that shows that a road kind of is there and kind of not. Here's what that same scene looks like today. Just a footpath crossing the lawn. Lawns and footpaths is what you get in the village today. But in the 30s, this was the main road, as I said. And here's a postcard from the 1930s. It shows that nice gravel road going south through the village. And here it is on the south hillside. Now, I don't have one looking south up this village, but this is looking down the Stagecoach Road into the park. And this is one of my favorite, this is a 1930s photograph. It's one of my favorites because I think it's just a beautiful view of coming into the park, and people would drive down into the park this way. Somebody else thought it was a beautiful view because they put it on the cover of Outdoor Indiana in June of 1934. So this is the road coming into the park in the early years of the park's existence as a state park. Where's that road today? Well, I'm back down in the village looking past the wood shop and the tavern, and it just kind of peters out. Where's that road up the hillside? There it is. There it is. Now just a little gravel path going up the hillside. There it is. Yes, the utility box there. Now in the spring when there's less undergrowth, it looks a little more like a road. And here's a view of the road looking down the hill, where you can kind of see that once this was a road grade, as recently as the 1930s when it was closed off. Now again, with this map, that's this road going down through the village that's now called the Stagecoach Trail. Here's the 1932 map again, so you can compare that. Cars, you'd come in through the gate, you'd come on these old roads and drive right through the village. Part of that road today looks like this, just an indentation. Here's what the entrance to the park looked like in the 1930s. Here's what the entrance, that old entrance, looks like today. This is that exact same scene as the entrance was moved to the south side. And I'm standing on one of the stepped off roads that you... And that road that I took that picture from, then I turn around, take this picture going south. That is then the road that goes off to Orleans, Paoli, and places south. Not really, not anymore, but it did in the 19th century. When that was the gateway to the park, things were going on there. This is a gas station, grocery store, tourist cabins. But when the gate was moved, that's what those buildings look like today. And the guy that lives there is trying to get the DNR to restore his house to the splendor of it in the 1930s. He hasn't had any luck. Yeah. But that's that site right outside the old entrance. And again, here's the current map of the county. That's right here, right there, where you used to come into the park. Now that's closed off. And again, that's this spot right here. This road comes up. It came through the village and on to the south. So that's the park story. And I want to take a few minutes here at the end to come back to roads, to come back to rivers and railroads. I've been giving you a lot of road stuff. So let's come back to the river and the railroads again here in the last few minutes. This is the crossing of the White River by the current CSX railroad, but it's the same site as the O&M, the Ohio and Mississippi, crossed in 1857. And here is the map that shows how that worked. This railroad followed the White River Valley So it was a fairly low grade, running about 500, around 500, 520 feet above sea level. And at some point it had to come up 150 feet, and the way to do that was to come up the Mill Creek Valley. Here's Spring Mill, here's the creek flowing out of the caves there, and this valley became the way the railroad came out, went right past Spring Mill Village. There are two tunnels, there were two tunnels in Lawrence County. One of them is here, it's called Big Tunnel. The other one is there, which was shorter, so it was called Little Tunnel. And Little Tunnel was daylighted, as railroad buffs say, which means they blew the top off of it and made it a cut in 1899. But Big Tunnel is still there. So in order to avoid big cuts, they built a couple of tunnels and then crossed the river and came out. Here's another view of that that's a little bit with the same, this is again 1879, showing the Spring Mill area here and the railroad coming down. And this is the connection with the river as well. When shipment was done by flatboat, these roads followed up to the river on that, at this particular point.
Numbers denote acres?
Yes, acres, right, of properties. One way to think about the railroads, but also I think it's helpful with the rivers, is to think about the vertical as well as the horizontal. And to do that, you need a topo map like this one. This shows elevations. Here's put in the gist of it here, the context. Here's Mitchell. This is not a real current map, but it's a modern map. Here's Mitchell. Here's the river, and here's the railroad, and here's Spring Mill. We'll come in a little closer here. The closer together the contour lines are, the sharper the hill, the bluff. And they're 10 feet, they show 10 feet of elevation. And these, well actually these aren't 10, well never mind, but they show elevation. When you see a whole bunch of brown lines stacked up against each other, you know you've got a cliff, a big hill, a big bluff. And you get a lot of that here around Spring Mill. Spring Mill is essentially a cave system in the Mitchell Plain of caves, a karst, it's all karst, that's collapsed in antiquity, time immemorial. And the two springs that come out, several springs, but the two main ones, Hamer Creek and Donaldson Creek, flow together to form Mill Creek, which flows into the White River. And there are other streams along the southern part of the White River that operate the same way. They flow from caves and flow into the White River. So that's what Mill Creek is. Looking closely at the point at which Spring Mill people accessed the river and where the railroad comes through too. Let's look first at the river point here, even closer. This bend in the river, this is now an artificial lake called Mystic Lake that was built in the mid-20th, 1950s, I think. This point here, if you go down on the ground, it looks like this. And this is one of the other pictures that I gave you because it shows river access and it suggests something about flatboat building. This was a great spot for building flatboats. It's called Boatyard Bend. It was called then and still is sometimes because the way you work with flatboats is you build them on solid ground and then when the spring floods came, they would lift the boats up and you'd go down the river. So what you want is a shelf of land. You don't want a marsh, a fully flooded area, a shelf of land that's about 5-6 feet above the low flow of the river. You build your boats, spring comes and it lifts them off and you head down to the Wabash, the Ohio, the Mississippi, and New Orleans, if that's where you want to go. So that's what this spot is. It's Boatyard Bend. And here's another view of Boatyard Bend from the bluff above it. And if I turn around and take a picture, there's a picture of Mystic Lake. So let's talk a couple things about the railroads, and then I'll wrap it up here. Again, here's this map that shows what the railroad here was doing, following the river, running about 20 feet above the river to stay out of the floodplain, and then coming south and coming up about 150 feet. The river runs about 500 feet above sea level. Mitchell, on the Mitchell Plain, is 685 feet. The railroad ran 15, 20 feet above the river level. So we're talking 150, 180 feet. The railroad needed to come up in about 5 miles. That's a hard grade, but it's 1% or less. And that's what the railroad was trying to achieve, always staying below a 1% grade as they crossed. But this was the hardest area between Cincinnati and St. Louis for that railroad to build, and it was the last one built. If we look up, this is a fairly current map. The old grade of the railroad made this turn, which you can still see on the topographical map. The new one that was built in the 1930s or 40s is much smoother. This is the old grade at near Mill Creek. And this is the third of the 3 pictures I showed you that shows the mill, what's known as the Mill Creek cut. This is a railroad cut that was completed in 1857 to bring that railroad into the Mill Creek Valley and up onto the Mitchell Plain. That railroad, by the way, then crosses Lawrence County and comes back to the White River at Shoals, and going downhill off the Mitchell Plain in western Lawrence County and in Martin County was a big deal too, with a lot of engineering work that needed to be done. But it rejoins the White River at Shoals. So this is a cut that's abandoned. And here's another view of it. Down below, and all of this was cut with dynamite and hard work and mules and men in 1857. The last spike was driven for that railroad at that site in 1857, and this is a news story about it in the New York Tribune, and it reads like the usual promo news stories of great capitalist works of the 19th century. On Wednesday, the last huge fragment of blasted rock was rolled out of the through cut of the Ohio and Mississippi Road this side of Mitchell. And at 20 minutes past 3, Daniel D. Page spiked the last rail in the 340 miles of iron road connecting Cincinnati and St. Louis. At a festival given in commemoration of this event, Mr. Barlow gave the second sentiment, the health of Aspinall and his New York associates, who came forward in the hour of imminent peril and secured to the west the completion of her greatest road. Blasting rock was important to railroad building. Blasting money out of Wall Street was much more important, and that's who all these characters are. In 1857, this road almost wasn't finished because of lack of financing. I don't have a picture of the building of the digging of the Mill Creek cut, but this is Little Tunnel being built in 1857. And the genius behind this was this guy, O.M. Mitchell, and he's a figure of real interest and importance. Not only did he survey the railroad, but then when they needed the money, he went to Europe and raised money. But what he's most famous for, well, of course, what I like best about him is he was a college professor, but what he's most famous for is the founding of the Cincinnati Observatory, where some of you may have visited, which was the most important telescope in the Western Hemisphere for a while. So he's a character worth knowing, and the town of Mitchell is named after him. So where that railroad crossed Mill Creek was once a bridge. It still is. This is the old bridge. And here's what that bridge looks like on the top of it. It's completely abandoned. And part of the railroad right-of-way is this, of that old one. But the new Mill Creek cut looks like this. It's a much more gradual curve and a gradual grade coming up onto the Mitchell Plain. Here's a view of the crossing of Mill Creek, which is now an enormous fill, so it was already, it achieved some altitude, but now this is current. And here's the railroad near Spring Mill State Park as it's on its way to Mitchell. Just a couple of things to look at here from one more map is that railroad on a geological map, which shows what you now know coming up Mill Creek and past the park area, which is this. Here's Hamer Cave, here's Donaldson Cave, here are the old roads. But by the 1920s, when this map was made, no longer is the building on there or the road through it. But one thing that this map has that I find particularly fascinating is that it shows a switch, a siding right by, on the property of Spring Mill Park, or just north of it. And that's an important thing that I'm not going to tell you anything about now, but I'm going to tell people about it in October down at the mill when I talk about the history of the mills and the railroad in Spring Mill State Park.
Could I ask you a question about the grade involved there?
Uh-huh.
At that point, which direction is upgrade?
Oh, it's up coming from the river
Okay.
up to here. So the river up here is about 500 feet. By here, the lake, Spring Mill Lake, is almost at the same level as the river.
Okay.
But it's almost 150 feet above that level by the time you get to
So
Spring
they're
Mill
pulling
Park.
grade to get to that point right there?
Yeah, they're coming 3 miles or so to come up 140 feet or so. Yeah, if you're figuring railroad grades, I mean, if 50 feet to the mile is about 1%, you know, there's 5,000 feet in a mile, and 50 is 1% of 5,000. So here's your host at Big Tunnel. And
That's haunted, by the way.
it's haunted, so of course I couldn't go in. And here's my favorite Big Tunnel picture to leave you with this. This is looking west from the top of the hill that Big Tunnel comes out of. On its way to Tunnelton, to Spring Mill, to Mitchell, to Shoals, to Lagodi, to Washington, to Vincennes, to St. Louis, and the promoters would want you to believe to the Pacific coast, which it never quite did, but that was the plan. So that's the story here of rivers, roads, and rails. And here's another Big Tunnel picture for you to leave you with this.
Oh, so you actually did go in it?
I did. Yeah, I did go in. But not the haunted part. Now, I've taken a lot of your time here, and I'm willing to talk to any of you for a long time afterwards, but I know that a lot of you want to get going, so please go if you want to get going. Ask questions if you want to ask questions. And one more thing before you go. I brought some copies of a handout of 4 Spring Mill maps, 1879, 1915, and 1932, and today. So you can, I think that's what they are. Yeah, right. So if you want to come up and grab one of these before you go, you may.
Really good. Thank you.